Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all again, and I hope we have an interesting evening. This is where I left off yesterday. Camp David. It's anyway. We talked about yesterday. It's very, very hard, very difficult to try to find some way to bring some kind of peaceful settlement here. So, and each side has its own position, its own story, its own narrative, its own red lines, its own aspirations and desires, its own expectations and assumptions. And to be honest, they're all mutually incompatible. It's impossible for everybody's desires, wishes, and assumptions and expectations to be fulfilled in this world anyway. Maybe in the spiritual world it's not. But certainly in this world, it requires a lot of negotiation, a lot of compromises, and it requires people to let go of different expectations and assumptions and sometimes cross some of their red lines and realize the only way we're going to do this is if we make some progress towards the middle, where both sides can to some extent have their own positions recognized and keep their face in that sense. Anyway, so President Clinton at that time, he invested a huge amount in trying to bring some kind of resolution. It's one of his major concerns was this. And he brought together then Ehud Barak, who was then Prime Minister of Israel, and Arafat, who was the, I'm not quite sure what his formal title was, but anyway, head of the PLO, later became Fatah, to negotiate the final status settlement. That was what they wanted to achieve. But basically, they couldn't find agreement over the three issues. One was territory. So obviously, because of what happened in 1967, then Israel ended up occupying Gaza and the West Bank. As I said to you before, Israel didn't want to occupy Gaza and the West Bank and actually wanted to return Gaza back to Egypt, which, because it had been part of Egypt before, wanted Egypt to administer the Gaza Strip. But Egypt wouldn't take responsibility for Gaza, so Israel then was left as the occupying power, administering Gaza. The other, of course, was the West Bank, which again, Israel hoped to be able to return to Jordan, because after 1948, Jordan annexed the West Bank. And so Israel then in 1967, having occupied the West Bank unintentionally, wanted to be able to make a peace agreement with Jordan by returning the West Bank to Jordan. Anyway, those things didn't work out, as I said, and then the Likud government, so about 5 or 6 years later, started to encourage Israelis to go and make settlements. And so settlements started to develop on the West Bank and a few also in Gaza as well. So anyway, so at this sort of conference, and Barak offered Arafat 94% of what he wanted, which meant adjusting the boundaries, adjusting the borders. But one of the things that Israel wouldn't give up was Jerusalem. So in 1948, Israel occupied part of Jerusalem. In 1967, it was able to occupy the whole of Jerusalem, including the old city, which obviously. And Israel then wanted to have Jerusalem as its capital. The Palestinians wanted to have East Jerusalem back, and they also wanted to have Jerusalem as their capital. To be honest, there's no way that Israel would ever give up having Jerusalem as its capital. Originally, I think the capital was in Tel Aviv, well, then it moved to Jerusalem, and they built a parliament there. So I've often heard Palestinians say, we want to have Jerusalem as our capital. And I'm thinking, well, on what basis? Jerusalem was never the capital of anything in the Ottoman Empire before there ever was such a thing or entity as Palestine, because Palestine didn't exist as a separate entity. It was always just part of the district of Syria. It never had its own separate state. It never had its own capital. So there's no historical basis for Jerusalem to be the capital for Palestinians or of Palestine. As far as religious, Palestine is not a religion. The Palestinians are a people, they're Arabs, and a mixture of Jews and Christians. So of course, Jerusalem, the old city, there's the Al-Aqsa Mosque there, which of course is the second most holy I think it's the second most holy Muslim site, and Israel, recognizing that, left the administration of the Temple Mount and the holy sites to Jordan, and never aspired to administer or take control over the Temple Mount. Well, so it's a religious center, not a political center for Muslims in Jerusalem. And so, I thought, well, okay, what should be the capital of Palestine? Personally, I think it should be Ramallah. I can't see any legal or moral or religious justification for Jerusalem being the capital of Palestine. There's no historical basis, no legal basis there. It's just an aspiration, because obviously it's very prestigious to have Jerusalem as your capital. But that's all it is. It's just a desire to want to have it, as opposed to having any historical, legal, or political basis for it. The Temple Mount, well, as I said, up until now, as far as I know still, the Temple Mount is administered by Jordan, and that was part of the agreement which Israel made a peace treaty with Jordan. Israel was happy to transfer the administration of the Temple Mount to the Palestinian Authority, if that's what they wanted. But the Palestinian Authority said, we want to have sovereignty over the Temple Mount, not just to administer it in the way that Jordan does, but actually have sovereignty over it. This then would mean that the Wailing Wall would be administered by the Palestinian Authority. So obviously for the Jewish people and for Israel, it's unacceptable for the Wailing Wall, which is the closest that Jews are able to get to the old temple, to be administered by a Palestinian Authority. So that was a stumbling block as well. Another one is the whole issue of refugees. As I said before, there were about between 500,000 and 600,000 refugees from Palestine. They went to surrounding Arab countries. And the question is, well, what to do with them? Well, as I said yesterday, personally, I think that all the refugees from Palestine, they're all Arabs, they all speak Arabic. They should have all settled and been allowed to settle in the countries which they fled to as refugees. So they should have been given, Jordan, of course, did that. Jordan gave all the Palestinian refugees Jordanian citizenship, allowed them to get employment and settle down and to move, etc., etc. And I think that's what Egypt and Syria and Lebanon, they should have all done the same thing. Unfortunately, they didn't, and they remained in the refugee camps. To be honest, I don't know of anywhere else that did that. And as I said, after the end of the Second World War, there were millions of people who were refugees, but they were all settled and given citizenship in the country which they went back to. So all the Germans who lived in what were then part of Poland, when the border moved, all the Germans living in that west part of Poland or were forced out, had to go back to Germany. And they weren't put in refugee camps in the expectation that the border would go back and they'd be able to get their homes and their land and their towns and cities back. They were just given German citizenship and they got on with life. And that's the same happened throughout Europe. There are millions of refugees. They weren't kept in refugee camps. And I can't imagine, when people come to this country as refugees, they're not, Britain has a terrible reputation for the way in which it deals with refugees, because we don't actually make it easy for them to get employment and everything else, and get accused. But, if you imagine if people came to this country as refugees and put in refugee camps, and 60 years later were still living in refugee camps, you'd think that was an outrage. Don't know anybody else that does that. And then, so why are all the Palestinian refugees not given citizenship by all these Arab countries? The only reason is because these Arab countries want all these Palestinians to go back to Palestine or Israel and to reclaim their homes and towns and villages. So that's the idea of the right of return. But nobody else has the right of return. All the, I said, 800,000 Jews that were expelled from Arab countries in 1948, none of them have the right of return. None of them even demand the right to return, to go back to all these countries and reclaim their homes and their businesses. They've just settled down, whether it's in Israel or America or wherever it is that they ended up. So again, I don't know. And again, if you look at what happened between India and Pakistan, again, around about the same sort of time, 1948, 49, 50, huge numbers of people, millions of people moved between India and Pakistan. Muslims and Hindus moved, and Sikhs as well. And again, nobody says that we want the right of return to go back to where we were. They all just settled down and got on with life. They were given citizenship, included back into the country in which they settled. And so what is the basis of this right of return? It's that if all the refugees, well, most of them are a lot of them have died now, but if these refugees and their children and grandchildren go back to Israel, then of course the result would be that Israel would no longer have a Jewish majority. And then Israel would no longer exist as a Jewish state. And then Israel itself basically would no longer exist, because that was the aspiration, desire of the Arab countries. So the reason for them being kept as refugees is not because of caring about them, it's for political ends to get rid of the state of Israel. That's the only reason. And I think that's a terrible way to behave and to treat people as pawns in your own political game, as opposed to thinking, okay, you're a refugee, we're going to embrace you, we're going to give you citizenship, the right to work, the right to move, the right to live anywhere within our country, and to basically, and I think it's terrible, the fact they've been treated as pawns like this. Anyway, so Arafat was blamed for the failure of the summit, but at the same time, as I said, Arafat realized he could only go a certain distance. If he went as far as was necessary to go to be able to achieve a final state of settlement, he probably would have been assassinated. That's the reality. So yeah, sometimes it's very difficult to make that to move as far as you need to move, because you realize, as I said yesterday, you need to lead your people with you. If a leader gets too far out on a limb, they get assassinated, as Rabin was assassinated, as Gandhi was assassinated, as Sadat was assassinated. As a leader, one has to invest most of one's time actually in education. If you want to get to a certain place, you have to educate people so they also want to get to the same place as you do. And they feel, yes, that is where we should go. And so if you look at Gandhi and you look at Martin Luther King, most of the time they weren't giving speeches to, Gandhi didn't spend most of his time giving speeches to the British authorities in India, or speeches about independence. Martin Luther King didn't spend most of his time giving speeches to Washington. Most of the time, both of them spent giving speeches and talks to their own people that they were leading, to educate them in the right way in which they should behave, non-violence, civil disobedience, and also explaining to them the only way to achieve the vision was in this particular way. And it took a lot of time. And they're very, very patient. And Gandhi said it's better to wait and to get independence, and not to get independence now if we're going to get it through violence, because it means that men of violence will form the government, and it'll be even worse than it was under the British. He said it's better to wait, even if it takes us an extra 10 or 20 or 30 years, it's better to achieve independence through non-violence in a peaceful way, and to establish a proper functioning democracy so that the leaders of our country after the British have gone can be democratically elected leaders who achieve power through the ballot box and not through the bullet, not through violence. So that's required a lot of education to get to that point. Unfortunately, that kind of education, to be honest, hasn't really been going on here. And Arafat, coming from his own background, which I explained, he was the nephew of this radical Palestinian extremist, nationalist, and he had the same kind of ideas in his head. And I don't think he ever made that journey within himself. And he certainly wasn't able to guide and lead the people in Palestine to make that journey. And so that's, I think, why it broke down. So there's a breakdown. Anyway, some years later, there was a second intifada. So this was sparked off by the then Prime Minister of Israel, Sharon, who had been a military leader in the war 1973. And he visited the Temple Mount, which is a very unusual thing for an Israeli politician to do. But before he visited the Mount, he got the approval and agreement of Arafat and other officials. It's really important. He didn't just think, oh, I'm going to go there because it's part of Israel, therefore I have the right to go there. He was very sensitive. He got their agreement, and they said, okay, you can go there. Well, what happened is that the next day, riots broke out in Jerusalem and on the West Bank. And this became the second intifada. And some analysts believe that this intifada was pre-planned and orchestrated. In other words, Palestinian officials thought, okay, well, let Sharon go there, and then we can use this as a pretext to instigate a second intifada. And that was a disaster, to be honest. Again, led again to the descent into worse violence in the first one. It's much more orchestrated in the first one, which is much more spontaneous. Lots of riots, murders by Palestinians. And then in response, the Israelis behaved in a very heavy-handed way. It just made things worse and worse. During the first intifada, Palestinians just had rocks. During the second one, they smuggled in illegal weapons. And so the violence was far, far worse. Also a lot of suicide bombings, like Palestinians, of civilians in clubs, hotels, buses, cafes. Yeah. I mean, there was something quite awful. And the conflict got more and more intense. And then the Israeli Defense Forces, they reoccupied Palestinian areas. Up until then, as much as possible, they'd withdrawn from Palestinian areas. And they didn't, as much as possible, didn't enter Palestinian areas unless there was a problem, unless there was a terrorist who they wanted to arrest or whatever. And now they reoccupied a lot of Palestinian areas. During this time, 5 years, 150 suicide bombings. And a lot of these suicide bombers that came from this town called Jenin. And so it's a battle for Jenin, 2002, the IDF moved in there. And 52 Palestinians were killed and 23 Israeli soldiers were killed. Actually, you can see many Israeli soldiers were killed. That's because they exercised a lot of restraint. They didn't take the Russian approach. Let's just indiscriminately just destroy all the buildings. They're very, very targeted in the buildings that they attacked and the people they wanted to kill. As a result of that, a lot of them, Israeli soldiers were killed, considering what normally happens when in this situation. And 52 Palestinians were killed. Again, you look at what's going on in Iraq in the past, or in Ukraine now, the numbers are very small, to be honest. And Jenin then, as I told you about yesterday, that was the town in which there was a workshop just 2 or 3 weeks ago. Two or 3 weeks ago, to introduce this program, My World and I, which I developed and helped to get published there. So Ghassan Abdullah, he said, this is where I want to go. And these are the schools where I want to introduce the books, My World and I, My Journey in Life, because these are the most extremist cities and towns and schools. And those are the places where they really need to study this course. So they can have a different, so change the way in which they think. So instead of thinking they can achieve independence through the use of violence and suicide bombing, which is going to make things worse, have a change of mindset. And then to look at Israelis and Jews differently, and to think, okay, there must be a different way in which we can resolve and solve this problem, not through the use of violence, but in a peaceful way. Anyway, after this, then Israel started to build a separation barrier. And was what called the Fence for Life movement started in 2001. A lot of Israelis, especially those whose relatives have been killed in these suicide bombs, they said, we can't live like this. It's incredibly stressful. You know, every few days, there'll be some rockets or some suicide bomb or some terrorist outrage or somebody getting stabbed or murdered. It was incredibly stressful for people who are living there. Suddenly the air raid sirens go off, you have to rush down into an air raid, into a cellar to protect yourself. You can see what's going on in the Ukraine, which is obviously a lot worse, but a similar sort of thing went on for years in Israel, similar kind of fear. And of course in Palestine as well. Not easy, very stressful. So the idea of building this was to prevent terrorists from entering Israeli cities and prevent the illegal entry by Palestinians. And it approximately follows the 1949 Green Line. 1949? Okay, that's what it says. It's not supposed to be a legal border. And it's very intimidating, a huge, incredibly high wall, as you can see there, to prevent people not just climbing over, but actually throwing things over. And as a result of the building of this barrier, incidents of terrorism were reduced by 90%, so it works. There are fewer checkpoints and roadblocks and Israeli incursions. And then this led to, because of the decline in terrorism, increased economic growth on the West Bank and in Israel as well. The problems were, or what you could say against this separation barrier, is most of the barriers built illegally on Palestinian land. I think that's an outrage. I can understand building a barrier, but if you're going to build a barrier, you should build it on your own land. The fact that most of it's built illegally on Palestinian land, I think that's unacceptable. I think it's perfectly acceptable to build a barrier because you have a right to protect yourself, but not to build it on somebody else's land. Another problem is that this barrier went through Palestinian communities and separated some of them. And it made access to services, livelihoods, religious and cultural amenities much more difficult. Because when you look at the barrier, it's not a straight line. It weaves in and out of the different settlements and everything, and makes it very difficult. You can't just cross over the barrier because there aren't very many cross checkpoints. Also led to the destruction of trees, loss of agricultural land, and people said it's an attempt to annex Palestinian land and to preempt final status negotiation. Israelis deny that, but that's quite possible. And around about this time, or when all this was going on, there was, of course, I just want to mention this, because it comes up later, totally out of the blue, 9/11, 2001. People going into the new millennium, thought the new millennium is going to be peaceful, we will solve the problems of communism, etc., etc. And then suddenly, totally out of the blue, incredibly shocking, was the attack on the Twin Towers and other places around that area. And very, very shocking, as I'm sure some of you watched it. And then it was from Al-Qaeda. And this is a letter written by Osama bin Laden to explain and to justify what it was that he was doing. And, you know, he's an Islamist, a Muslim. And so he gave, naturally, a Muslim explanation and justification for their actions. So he said, permission to fight against disbelievers, these are from the Quran, this is a passage from the Quran, permission to fight against disbelievers is given to those believers who are fought against, because they've been wronged, and surely Allah is able to give them, the believers, victory. So who are the disbelievers? Well, those are people either who don't believe in God, or people who are not monotheists. So for Muslims, the greatest theological sin is called, it's to believe that is not to be a monotheist, to believe that God has a partner. Christians then believe believe Jesus is God, and for Muslims it's unacceptable. It's a sin. It's like a form of anyway. So Muslims then believe that all Christians, apart from Unitarians, are all going to go to hell because they are not monotheists. So these are non-disbelievers in that sense. Shirk, that's right. The sin of shirk, which is, and so, okay, so the point here is, in the Quran it says, because they have wronged and those who fought against us. Okay, so Americans are thinking, well, how do we fight against you? How have we wronged you? And so this is Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamist explanation or justification. Because you attacked us. Okay, where did we attack Islam, Muslims? Attacked us in Palestine, where we've been looking at that, in Somalia, and also you support governments which oppress us, such as all the dictators, Saddam Hussein, and you know all these dictators that were supported by the West. Also, you support Jews in a false claim to Israel. So again, as I mentioned before, we look at Islam, that Muslims see Muhammad as a seal of the prophets, and Muslims as the heir to all the promises given to Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. So all the promises and the covenants made with Abraham, Moses, Jesus, etc., they're all being transferred to Islam. Islam is the heir to all of these. So Jews then make a false claim to Israel because the Jews failed, according to Muslims, and so they lost their claim and their right to Israel, because this right to occupy the promised land given to Abraham was inherited by Muslims, Muslims. So Muslims then, they say that Adam, Abel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Jesus, they say they are all Muslims. And so Jews then, they lost their right to the Holy Land because they failed. So now only Muslims then can occupy the Holy Land. So they say that the Jews' claim to live in the Holy Land is a false claim. And this is part of what's going on with the Palestinians, especially Hamas. Also, they said you steal oil at low prices. So of course, there were these issues here with Western oil companies extracting oil from Iran and other countries and making much more money out of it than the countries from which the oil was taken. Also, Iraqi children are starving. So again, this is connected to what went on after the invasion of Iraq. Well, not the invasion of Iraq. This was after the first Gulf War, when Iraq was driven out of Kuwait and the no-fly zone was established. And there was a lot of suffering by Iraqis. And so he said, we have the right to resist you. You attacked us, so we have the right to resist you. And people said, well, okay, why didn't you attack the American army instead of flying airplanes into blocks of offices and killing thousands of civilians who are just working there, they're just going about their daily job. So Osama bin Laden's justification is, there are no civilians because the United States is a democracy. In other words, all your leaders are elected. In other words, you elect the leaders that are oppressing Muslims and doing these things. Therefore, you can be held responsible for all the things that your country is doing. Therefore, you're not civilians. You're implicated. And secondly, you pay taxes, and your taxes fund the military. So again, you're not really, you may say you're civilians, but actually you're valid targets. And so what was the expectation of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and Islamists? They say, okay, Osama bin Laden said, the first thing that we're calling you is is Islam. In other words, you should become Muslims. The religion of the unification of God, sincerity, the best of manners, righteousness, mercy, honor, purity, and piety. In other words, you should all become Muslims and you should all adopt these kind of virtues, which are Muslim virtues, which Osama bin Laden said you don't have. And Osama bin Laden said Islam is a religion of showing kindness to others, establishing justice between them, granting them their rights, and defending the oppressed and persecuted. And to be honest, Islam is like this. In theory, Islam is an incredibly advanced and well-developed religion, which is why it had such a high culture and civilization for 1,000 years. The second thing we call you to is to stop your oppression, lies, immorality, and debauchery that is spread among you. So he's saying to the people of America and the West, we call you to be people of manners, principles, honor, and purity, to reject the immoral acts of fornication, homosexuality, intoxicants, gambling, and trading with interest. You should stop all these immoral activities and behaviors. And they said, what you do, you invent your own laws. You exploit women, prostitution, you have atom bombs, and you're just a bunch of hypocrites, really. So inventing your own laws. So yeah, this is a very old idea. It goes way back to Sinai, that God revealed the law at Mount Sinai. So you can't change the law that God revealed. The 10 Commandments, all the laws in Leviticus, that was all revealed by God at Mount Sinai to Moses. So it can't be changed, can't be abolished, they're just there. They can be interpreted, and so they can be applied in different circumstances, but you can't actually say, okay, we disagree with this law against stealing or adultery, or whatever. Can't change them, or homosexuality. And so Osama bin Laden, the Muslim accusations, well, look, you changed them, you invented your own laws. You made laws allowing for homosexuality, or for this, or for that. You invented your own laws, and instead of just observing God's law, which for Muslims is the Sharia. And you exploit women. The theoretical status of women in the Muslim world is actually much better than it has been historically in the Christian world. Thirdly, we call you to take an honest stance with yourself. In other words, admit you've made mistakes. We advise you to stop supporting Israel. We also advise you to pack your luggage and get out of our lands. In other words, leave Iraq because after the first Gulf War, then a lot of Israeli military was stationed in Muslim countries, in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait and other places. They said, you have to go, leave. Sixthly, we call upon you to end your support of the corrupt leaders in our countries. Again, an objection to the fact that America had been sponsoring and supporting for a long time. Saddam Hussein was supported by America. All kinds of other leaders as well in Egypt and other places. We call you to deal with us and interact with us on the basis of mutual interests and benefits. So that was Osama bin Laden's letter. Anyway, so as a result of that incredibly shocking event, Al-Qaeda at that time was based in Afghanistan. And so George Bush decided to invade Afghanistan. 20 years, the occupation, attempted occupation, the war in Afghanistan. So what should have happened then? It should have just been a police operation. So what should have happened is that America should have sent special forces the next day, should have sent special forces into Afghanistan, and they should have assassinated or arrested and eliminated Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda while they were still sitting there in Afghanistan. Should have been done the next day, and it could have been done. Instead, they decided to invade Afghanistan. By the time they got around to invading Afghanistan, then Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden had left. They never caught them until finally tracked Osama bin Laden down in Pakistan. So that was a total disaster. It should have just been a very simple, straightforward police operation. Instead, America invaded Afghanistan. They decided to bomb it from 50,000 feet and turn over the rocks and rubble, and created and then decided it needed to overthrow the Taliban. And then it created, just endless war, huge suffering. And then when it left just this year, a huge humanitarian crisis, because Afghanistan was basically supported by a lot of aid. The aid's been cut off. And so you might have seen on the television the last few weeks, the incredible suffering that's going on there now in Afghanistan. Totally unnecessary. Yes, Al-Qaeda was based there, but it should have been a police operation to get rid of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Didn't need to invade the country, didn't need to try to occupy the country, didn't need to try to do regime change and try to create a democracy there. If the people want to live in a Muslim country, in a Muslim state, according to Sharia and the Taliban, that's their, just let them do that, Anyway, after that, without any legal, moral, or strategic justification, then the United States, and Britain, Blair and Bush, and with the support of some other countries like Australia, invaded Iraq. As I said, there was the first Gulf War, which I think was justified, when Saddam Hussein invaded and occupied Kuwait. I think it was quite justified for the United Nations to expel Iraq from Kuwait and make Kuwait an independent nation again. It's good to go to the aid of a country that's been invaded to re-establish its independence and to not allow people to invade other people's countries. That was justified. In fact, America stayed on rather long, I think wasn't, but anyway. But with the invasion of Iraq then, there was no legal basis for this. What's his name? The then Kofi Annan, I think it was, who then was the head of the United Nations, said it was an illegal act. It was not supported by the UN. There's no moral reason, justification for doing it. Saddam Hussein was in his box. There was a no-fly zone over the Kurdish areas, and so the Kurds then had been protected. Saddam Hussein wasn't going anywhere. He was not a nice man. He's a dictator, a very unpleasant person. The way he governed Iraq was very unpleasant. The things he did to the people of Iraq was terrible. The way he gassed the Marsh Arabs, for example, was terrible. A lot of the things he was doing were terrible. But at the end of the day, it was an orderly country and it was stable. And most people, as long as they didn't annoy the regime, got on with their life, business, and et cetera, et cetera. There's no moral justification or strategic justification for doing it. But, somehow George Bush connected Al-Qaeda with Iraq. Saddam Hussein was very much against Islamists. Saddam Hussein was a member of the Ba'athist Party. He was not a regular Muslim. He was from a Muslim sect, just as Assad in Syria from the same Ba'athist sect. He wasn't a regular Muslim. He had no time for Islamists. And so there's no reason for this. There's no strategic justification for it. It was a total disaster. The result of it, between 150,000 and 1 million casualties in Iraq. So no matter how bad it was under Saddam Hussein, all you can say is after the invasion of Iraq, it became much worse. I think this is a terrible stain upon the West, destroying somebody else's country. And what was the reason? People say oil. Well, it's not oil. If you want oil, you just buy it. You just allow Iraq to sell oil. There's no, as a result of invading Iraq, America and nobody else got control over Iraqi oil. So if you actually find out what the justification was, well, Condoleezza Rice, who's the architect behind this whole policy, said it was a project to expand democracy. We want to go and impose democracy upon Iraq. In other words, she heard, okay, Al-Qaeda says we shouldn't be supporting all these dictators like Saddam Hussein. Okay, well, let's stop supporting all these dictators like Saddam Hussein. And let's go and make Iraq, for example, a democratic country. You can't impose democracy upon another country. It's an oxymoron. You can't just go there and impose it. So, incredibly naively, America invaded. They thought once we got rid of Saddam Hussein, then all Iraqi people, they'll all be overjoyed, they'll welcome us, and they'll just suddenly fall into, just behave like Americans, and they'll establish democratic political parties, and they'll have proper elections, and everything will work out peacefully. No understanding whatsoever of the way that these countries work and the culture. You can't impose democracy. You can't impose a culture of democracy. So what should have happened? Well, in my view, what should have happened is should have just let Saddam Hussein die. Eventually he would get old and he'd die. And then once he died, then the people of Iraq and the government of Iraq, the people around there would decide, okay, where do we go from here? And they would sort it out for themselves. And they would work out their own transition. And it may be that somebody better than Saddam Hussein would become the next president. You look at what happened to the Soviet Union. Did it become a democracy? Did Russia become a democracy because America and the West invaded the Soviet Union, destroyed and brought about regime change? No, eventually the old communists died off and a young communist called Gorbachev came along, and with some friends like Shevardnadze and Yeltsin, and they changed it. You just need to be patient. Just because you think you know what's best for other people doesn't mean you should go around doing it to them. You need to let other people sort out their own problems and their own affairs. That's what it is to treat somebody with respect. So these people then are called neoconservatives. So, okay, neo means new conservatives. So they're not. Anyway, in America, there's two types of conservatives. One called the paleoconservatives, the old-fashioned conservatives, rather like patricians, like English conservatives, Tory party. And there's a neoconservatives. So these, generally speaking, are neoconservatives. A lot of them were socialists in the past. They're very idealistic, but they realize the ideals of socialism are false ideals. It doesn't work. And so a lot of these people who became neoconservatives were socialists who realized that socialism doesn't work, but they still remained idealists. And they realized, oh, the correct ideal is actually free market, liberal democracy. That's the proper ideal, which they found in writers like Friedrich Hayek. And they, okay, let's go around imposing, instead of imposing socialism upon people, let's go around imposing free market liberal democracy upon people as well. And to be honest, that's the problem with idealists. They think they know what's best for other people better than they know what's best for themselves. And so that was a lot of it. So you look at these people, George Bush, evangelical Christian, he was a good person, a moral person. He didn't have affairs like Clinton did, or Trump did, but he was. Look at Condoleezza Rice, a lovely person, but the consequences of their policies were a total disaster. So these are, and America, when it invaded Iraq, it made a deliberate policy not to count the number of casualties. So that's why these are estimates from different kind of NGOs and different kind of people and different ways of counting. They're estimated because the numbers of people that were killed were not recorded. Anyway, one of the things that led to was the rise of ISIS. You know, Americans thought they solved it, but actually led to the rise of, certainly a civil war within Iraq between the Shia and the Sunni, which Saddam Hussein had been keeping the lid on. Because the Shia are actually the majority in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein, coming from a neither Sunni nor a Shia background, he was able to somehow impose order there and maintain some kind of stability. But anyway, when the whole thing collapsed, everything collapsed, all the army was dissolved, the civil service was dissolved, everything was dissolved. There was no order, just chaos. This led to the rise of ISIS because people wanted order and stability. ISIS was an Islamist kind of faction that developed in northern Iraq and very rapidly, as we remember, spread through a large part of Iraq. It's also led to the destabilization of the whole of the Middle East, this invasion of Iraq. Total disaster. A lot of the problems in the Middle East today are as a result of this. I said, if you're a leader, you have to make good decisions. If you make bad decisions, the results are catastrophic, not just for yourself, well, usually not catastrophic for yourself, they're catastrophic for other people. It also led to the rise of Iran. So there'd been the Iranian Revolution, 1979. Before that, there was the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran had been imposed by Britain and the United States together, because Iran before that had a democracy. They'd elected a democratic prime minister, but I can't remember all the details. I think he wanted to nationalize the oil, and various policies which Britain and America didn't approve of. So Britain and America, the CIA, organized a coup, and the democratic president was the prime minister of Iran was overthrown, and the Shah of Iran was put there. And anyway, so eventually there was an Iranian revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini, who was up until in exile in Paris, they overthrew the Shah. And then you had this huge Muslim revolution, Islamic revolution. The following year, there was the Iran-Iraq war. So that lasted for 8 years, an incredibly bitter war between Iran and Iraq. And basically Iraq, more or less won, I would say. But then and so there was like a balance of power in that part of the world between Iran and Iraq. Neither of them could dominate the region. But after the invasion of Iraq, Iraq has been wiped out. And now Iran is all powerful in that part of the world. So there's no longer a balance of powers there. And that's, as I said, it's a huge strategic mistake, invading Iraq. You might wonder where do these people get their ideas from? Okay, so that was going on. And at that time as well, it was going on a bit earlier. And so this is all part of the background, what was going on then, 2002, okay, we got 9/11 the year before. We need to try to deal with this problem in Israel and Palestine again, because it's causing so many problems in the Middle East. Yeah, I mean, as I said, this whole thing, it really was a disaster, destabilizing the Middle East. And especially, giving Iran the opportunity then to become the dominant power now in the Middle East, which, as I said before, there was a balance between Iran and Iraq in that part of the world. The majority of people living in Iraq, they're Shia Muslim. So it's like Iran's power and influence has grown hugely now by being able to have a large say in what goes on in Iran. As I said, it was so complicated. Okay, so oh yeah, this is where we got to. Okay, so then after all those things going on, 9/11, and all the consequences going on in the Middle East, then people often say that the main problem in the Middle East is a problem of Palestine, Israel and Palestine. Personally, I disagree, honestly speaking. This war between Iran and Iraq is a far bigger issue, and it would have happened whether Israel existed as a state or not. The Shia-Sunni conflicts and problems, they would exist whether Israel was there or not. The problems in Syria would go, and ISIS, they would all go on irrespective of whether Israel was there or not. I think, people go around blaming Israel for all the problems in the Middle East, but actually there are lots of endemic problems which are far, far older and go back thousands of years. And even if the problem between Israel and Palestine was sorted out peacefully, in whatever way, these kind of problems will still be there. Gaddafi, Egypt, all these things. Anyway, but people wanted to try and help again. So this is George Bush the younger. And by the way, in terms of the invasion of Iraq, which comes up a bit later, implications, Russia and Putin, they were very firmly against the invasion of Iraq. That's why I didn't have United Nations sanction, or it was illegal from a UN point of view. Putin is very, very wise about lots of things. He made a lot of mistakes just now, but in the past he realized actually it's not a good idea to invade Iraq. It's going to be a total disaster. He said to George Bush, don't get involved in Afghanistan. We tried it. The British tried it. Anybody gets involved in Afghanistan always loses. And I remember there's one British Prime Minister, I can't remember when it was now, but maybe 100 years ago. Anyway, and he asked his predecessor, do you have any advice for me? And his predecessor gave him one piece of advice: don't invade Afghanistan. But Britain did it 3 times already, and each time Britain was defeated. This last time was the 4th time. Don't invade Afghanistan. In Russia, there's a similar piece of advice from Pushkin, I think it was. Don't invade the Caucasus. In other words, around Chechnya and all these areas. You just end up with a bloody nose. Anyway, these are just pieces of strategic wisdom that, should get passed on from generation to generation. But unfortunately, most governments have a very short institutional memory, and they just end up repeating the same mistake over and over again, as George Bush did. Anyway, so as I said, Russia opposed the invasion of Iraq. But so here, though, realizing we'll try and sort this out, so had a quartet, United Nations, US, EU, and Russia, to try and resolve this situation, Israel-Palestine. Abbas, who was then Prime Minister in Palestinian Authority, and Sharon met at the Red Sea, in Jordan, to have a conference. So both of them, Sharon himself was, sort of right wing, in other words. He was a military leader, but at the same time, he was very realistic about, and so it's possible then to negotiate and do something. The goal then on both sides was an independent Palestinian state living side by side in peace with the state of Israel. So a 2-state solution, which is what both sides wanted. They came up with a roadmap, okay, we've got to do this in stages. We can't just have it overnight. And so this is phase 1 was supposed to be like this. There's going to be an end to Palestinian violence. In other words, no more suicide bombings and missile attacks. But in fact, even though they agreed that, the suicide bombings and the missile attacks continued. So Abbas himself, he had authority on the West Bank, but not in Gaza. There's supposed to be Palestinian political reform. So there was. The prime minister was appointed, and they had elections. I think that was 2005 to elect a president. In 2006, parliamentary elections. So they took place. And then on the Israeli side, the agreement was Israel would withdraw from withdraw eventually, from the Palestinian territories, and there'd be a freeze on settlement expansion. So again, this is going to happen in stages. So the following year, Israel left Bethlehem in 2003, and so there's no longer any Israeli presence, military presence there in Bethlehem. And then that worked out well. But Bethlehem is on the West Bank. And then in 2005, we couldn't get any kind of resolution with the problem in Gaza, which is incredibly difficult. So Israel then unilaterally left Gaza. There was so much violence in Gaza. It's impossible to have a peaceful withdrawal. So Israel just, okay, we're going to dismantle the settlements. And to dismantle the settlements, there weren't very many, just a few settlements there, agricultural settlements. That was incredibly unpopular in Israel, and it required basically force to remove the Israeli settlers from Gaza and to take them back to Israel. So Israel then withdrew unilaterally from Gaza and then closed some settlements on the West Bank. I can't remember how many or how many people are involved. As said, there are Palestinian elections. Mahmoud Abbas was elected president in 2005. And then there were parliamentary elections, which Hamas won. So throughout Palestinian territories, Hamas won more seats than anybody else. That was a huge shock for people. So who is Hamas? It was founded in 1987, and it stemmed, in terms of membership, in terms of policies and everything, it's an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was established in Egypt, as far as I remember, sometime in the 1950s. And it was founded in 1987 to liberate Palestine, including modern-day Israel. In other words, liberating modern-day Israel, from Jewish rule in that sense. To liberate the whole of Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, from Israeli occupation, and to establish an Islamic state in the area that is now Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. In other words, a single state, one state solution, which is, because it'd be a Muslim majority, it would then become a Muslim state, an Islamic state in that area. Obviously, from the point of view of Israel and Jews living in Israel, this is totally unacceptable, because it would be like going back and living in some European country again and suffering the same fate that they suffered in Germany and Poland, Austria, etc., etc. So it's totally unacceptable. It's basically threatening the existential existence of the state of Israel, which is obviously threatening the existential existence of Jews, who would be driven out of Israel and have to go and find refuge, become refugees somewhere else, probably in America, I guess. Yeah, it's difficult. It's not the only country that tried to do that in the past. Similar things went on, or similar aspirations, desires existed in Ireland in the early 20th century, which is why it was divided. So Hamas then has a social services wing. So for a long time it's involved in social welfare, education projects. It's got that wing, the social services wing, but also has a military wing. So it's not a terrorist organization alone. It's also a government. And so when it won the elections, it's able to, well, I'll come to that in a minute. So the military wing then engaged in suicide bombings and rocket attacks. Hamas isn't the only group in Gaza doing this. There are other Islamist and terrorist organizations in Gaza that are also doing these sorts of things as well. I said it won the election in 2006, been operating in Gaza for a long time, engaged in suicide bombings and rocket attacks. That's one of the main reasons why Israel built that wall, separation fence around Gaza, to prevent people coming across. So after it won the elections, it took control over Gaza from Fatah. So Fatah was the sort of political wing of the PLO, which was the one that Arafat was in charge of, that negotiated this thing, Peace Road. And the Fatah then was recognized from an international point of view of having authority to govern the Palestinian territories. In reality, under Fatah's control, it was incredibly chaotic, incredibly corrupt. There are lots of organized criminality and lots of really bad stuff was going on. Anyway, Hamas then, after winning the election, engaged in a war, basically civil war almost, with Fatah, and drove Fatah out of Gaza. It's the Battle of Gaza. So Fatah then was driven out of Gaza, and only now controls the West Bank. Some good things that Hamas did: they reformed the police services and security services from 50,000 down to 10,000. They became much more efficient and much less corrupt, and better able to do what they're supposed to be doing. It also costs less having 10,000 instead of 50,000 people. Then they cracked down on crime and gangs. So there's a lot of criminality when Fatah was running things, a lot of chaos, a lot of social disorders, basically almost a failed state, and a lot of gangs going around terrorizing people. So Fatah then, Hamas then imposed much more order in Gaza. And then people started paying their taxes, their electricity bills, and in return, authorities picked up garbage and put criminals in jail, which is what you're supposed to do if you're the government. So that was that good aspect. So, like everybody and everything, there's always a mixture of good and bad. The thing is to wean people away from the bad stuff and encourage them to continue doing the good stuff. So that was a phase one. Phase two was supposed to be an international conference to support Palestinian economic recovery and launch a process leading to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with provisional borders. So during this time, there were a lot of Palestinians who had left Palestine and become settled in America and other places. They got involved in business, all kinds of activities, gained skills, qualifications, and some of them thought, okay, maybe this is a good opportunity to go back to Palestine, to Gaza or the West Bank, and to start up business and to try and bring something back from what we've learned in America or elsewhere. But they found it was very difficult to do that because the economic environment wasn't suitable. There's still organized criminality, and so that didn't happen as well as it might have done. And to be honest, there's been relatively little investment by Arab countries in Palestine. Most of the money has come from Western NGOs. Not all that much money has come from incredibly wealthy, rich Arab countries who, to be honest, in many ways just wanted the problems to continue as opposed to wanting to solve the problem. So this should have led then to an independent Palestinian state, provisional borders, and there should have been then a revival of multilateral engagements on including all these areas here: water, environment, economic development, refugees, arms control issues. And then Arab states are supposed to restore links again with Israel. Didn't happen. The roadmap for peace broke down. As I said, Hamas was elected in Palestine on a platform of destroying the state of Israel. And then that means that Hamas then was not a partner with whom Israel was able to negotiate and work. Because you can't work with somebody if they refuse to accept your right to exist and they're just dedicated to eliminating you. So that was, I would say that was one of the main stumbling blocks. And then, of course, I said Hamas continued with terrorist activities, rockets, suicide bombings when they could. Because the separation fence, they invested a lot of money in building tunnels so terrorists could enter Israel through these tunnels. After lots of cement, a lot of stuff was sent from time to time into Gaza to rebuild Gaza after all kinds of different Israeli incursions and various things happened. But a lot of this economic aid and building materials and things, instead of being used for what they should have been used for, a lot of them were diverted to building tunnels under the separation fence to try and attack Israel. Then Iran then started becoming a major actor, has been for a while. It sponsored Hezbollah, which is similar to Hamas, but in the Lebanon. Hamas is Sunni, Hezbollah is Shia, and controls large parts of Lebanon, especially southern Lebanon, and also as amassing huge numbers of rockets, and from time to time fires rockets into Israel. And then when that happens, and Israel invades Lebanon to try to deal with that problem. Anyway, part of its goal also is to eliminate the state of Israel. And then Iran, interestingly enough, declared that it also is dedicated to eliminating the state of Israel. So this is kind of surprising because Iranians themselves are not anti-Jewish. So during the period of the Shah, After the state of Israel was established, it was like a difficult relationship, but like a cold relationship. When the Shah became the head of state in Iran, they had cordial relations, they worked together on different things. Anyway, then in 1979, with the Iranian Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, he broke off diplomatic relations with Israel, which is a shock. And then, but during the war between 1980 and 1988, between Iran and Iraq, Israel was a major supplier of arms and support to Iran. I think about 80% of the arms that Iran obtained to fight against Iraq came from Israel. So Sharon and others thought, okay, even though Iran's broken off diplomatic relations with us, we need to try to keep the door open. And so we're going to support them. At that time, that was a time when, as I said, Saddam Hussein was in charge of Iraq, and he also built a nuclear power station. And then with the intention, one suspects, of developing its own nuclear weapons. Anyway, Israel bombed this nuclear power station and did quite a few things to support and help Iran during this war between the two countries. But then in 2000, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, he called Israel a cancerous tumor at the heart of the Islamic world that should be removed from the region. So again, there's this Islamic vision that once the land becomes Muslim, then it has to remain Muslim for eternity. And so the idea of Jews going back into that land was only acceptable as long as they lived there under Muslim hegemony, under Muslim rule. The idea there could be a Jewish state in a land which was previously Muslim is theologically horrendous and unacceptable. Not just to Muslims, it was to Christians as well, which is why the Vatican didn't recognize the state of Israel until sometime, I think, in the 1970s or 80s, really late. Because again, it went against Christian doctrine and teaching that Jews should go back to Israel and reestablish a Jewish state. It's contrary to Christian doctrine and teaching. Anyway, so he said it's a cancerous tumor at the heart of the Islamic world, should be removed from the region. Then 2012, he said again, Israel's existence is responsible for many problems facing the Muslim world. I have to ask myself, is that really true? The war between Iran and Iraq, was that because of Israel? The wars and conflict between Shia and Sunni, is this because of Israel exists? All the stuff that's going on in Syria, is that because the state of Israel exists? The civil war there between the different factions, the different political and religious factions within Syria, the problems within Lebanon, is that because the state of Israel exists? I mean, Lebanon was a Christian majority, and then demographics changed, became a Muslim majority. And this is one of the reasons for the civil war, which started in the instability now in Lebanon. And so you have to think, well, why do people go around blaming the Jews for everything? It's just anti-Semitism. Who's responsible for the Twin Towers? Well, some people say Mossad, the Jews. Who's responsible for the First World War? Well, a lot of Europeans said the Jews. Who's responsible for the Second World War? A lot of people said the Jews. Who's responsible for the poisoning of the wells? The Jews. Who's responsible for COVID? There were some people going around saying the Jews. Who's responsible for the Black Death? Well, the Jews, they traveled a lot because they were merchants, they were responsible. And so you have to ask yourself, well, what's going on here? That the Jews in Israel gets blamed for everything, as opposed to people reflecting and thinking, well, did we do something wrong? Instead of treating Israel as a scapegoat for all the problems. Anyway, then we had the Arab Spring came along. I said, the invasion of Iraq, this destabilized the whole of the Middle East. It was a total disaster. And then in 2010, you had one could say something that came from that, a consequence, is the Islamic Spring, which a lot of people thought, this is wonderful, it's going to turn out brilliantly, it's wonderful. I said it's going to be a total disaster. And it's going to lead to, anyway, so people said, oh, you're wrong, William, you're always so skeptical, you're like Cassandra, you should be more hopeful and more optimistic and more idealistic. Anyway, I said it's going to be a total disaster. Anyway, anti-government protests and uprising against corruption, of which there's a vast amount in Arab countries, economic stagnation, because basically they have a state control of the economy, which leads to economic stagnation, and armed rebellions that spread across much of the Arab world. It started off in Tunisia, which is in West North Africa. There was a particular trader. He wanted to sell his goods in the market. It was just an ordinary person. He had to support his family. He went to the market to sell whatever he could sell in the market. But then the police came along, and I can't remember the details now. They said you don't have permission. In order to get permission, you got to get a license. To get a license, you got to bribe somebody. To bribe somebody money. And so they took away his scales, and he wasn't able to sell things to support his family. So as far as I remember, he set fire to himself as a protest. How can I live if I can't just sell things to earn money to support my family because of this state control and the corruption that goes with it and all the briberies and everything? And then it sparked something off, because so many people were in poverty, not because they didn't want to work, but because they weren't allowed to work because of the corruption and the state control, and you need a license for this and a license for that, and regulations this and regulations that. And the people enforcing the regulations wanted to get bribes. And that's socialism. It's what was going on all over the place. And then that spread from Tunisia in the markets there, and then spread to Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria. And some of the rulers were deposed. In Libya, it led to civil war, and Gaddafi was killed, and the civil war is still going on today. In Yemen, there's a civil war going on today, uprisings. In Syria, the whole thing, well, Assad is still there. He hasn't been deposed. But again, it sparked off this terrible civil war, the so-called Arab Spring, which is going to lead to democracy and all these nice things. It led to the worst outcome in the Muslim world, total disaster. And then also in Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Iran, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, Sudan, demonstrations and uprisings. And in many of these countries, they're able to keep control and put these uprisings down. Some countries couldn't, and they just fragmented, they broke up and became failed states. Iraq is a failed state. Why? Well, under Saddam Hussein, he was a dictator, but at least there was stability. When it's a failed state, you just have gang warfare and uprisings. That's what happens in Somalia. You know, if you watch that film of the American Hawk, you know, helicopters getting shot down, total disaster. So this led also to many major crises. So you've got the Syrian civil war, people starting to want to have freedom, democracy. And it's really interesting if you look at it. Most people in the West, they hate Saddam, they hate Assad. But actually, if you actually look and see what was going on, when there was when certain kind of unrest started happening, Assad came up with a plan to start to have reform within Syria and start to reform things in a more liberal democratic direction, while remaining president himself. But there were people who wanted things to rejected that. We want to go much faster, and had uprisings. And then the West wanted to get rid of Assad. To be honest, if you got rid of Assad, it would be like getting rid of Saddam Hussein. It would have been complete disaster. Because Assad, I said he was also from a Ba'athist, he was from a minority Muslim sect. And so because he's from a minority Muslim sect, it means he didn't represent a majority, so he wasn't oppressing people. Because he's from a Muslim minority sect, all the other minorities voted for him, except for the Muslim, regular Muslim majority didn't vote for him. But all the minorities, the Christian minorities, they all voted, and other Muslim minorities, the Druze and people, they all voted for Assad because they realized he himself comes from a minority, so he can keep the balance and maintain stability. If it became a Muslim majority, then you would have had the oppression of all these little minorities. And so that's why Assad was able to manage things. He didn't do it very well. He wasn't as bad as his father. His father, I think, massacres 50,000 people in Homs. He was a real brutal dictator. But all I can say is it maintained stability. It's the same in Libya. No matter how bad things were under Gaddafi, and from time to time, people who spoke out against Gaddafi got arrested and they got tortured, and Gaddafi's secret police were pretty nasty people. But for most people who didn't get involved in politics and just wanted to get on with life, their family, their business and everything, they were okay. There was stability. It was the same in Syria. There was stability and most people could just get on with life. Now it's a total disaster. Anyway, so Russia and the ISIS then, they moved up from Iraq, which had been destabilized by America and the UK. They moved into Syria and they started having these Islamists in Syria, who obviously didn't like Assad because he wasn't a regular Muslim. And Assad was trying to put them down, keep them in control. The West, unfortunately, instead of supporting Assad to maintain stability, they supported these and armed these so-called rebels who supposedly wanted to reform things and bring about freedom, democracy, but just a bunch of, gangs, basically. Anyway, Russia, for various reasons, its own strategic reasons, because it has a port in Syria, and for historical reasons, it supported Assad and fought against ISIS. And to be honest, the way Russians do their fighting is really bad. It's really unpleasant and really indiscriminate in the way in which they treat people that they're fighting against. But what they were doing, I would say, was the right thing, supporting Assad and maintaining some kind of stability in Syria. Britain and America didn't want to get involved for obvious reasons, because they thought, well, we got involved in Iraq and it was a disaster, because that was to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We got in Libya to get rid of Gaddafi. That was a disaster. Whereas actually, to be honest, they should have got involved in Syria to support Assad and support stability. Because the worst thing is when you have a failed state. To recover order is so difficult. It takes decades and centuries. Anyway, that's my view. Major ISIS crisis in Iraq because of the Arab Spring. In Egypt, there was, you probably watched it on television, the overthrow of Mubarak. Then this Islamist was elected into power. So people think, get rid of Mubarak, and the Egyptians are going to elect some nice liberal Democrat. Doesn't work like that. Doesn't work like that. And so you had some Islamists elected, and then the army then staged a coup, because the army in Egypt runs half the economy, and most of the money that comes into Egypt from America goes to the army. And so this Islamist, he wanted to reduce the size of the army, get rid of the corruption there, and the army wouldn't have any of that. And so he was overthrown and he got Egypt back where it is now. Of course, the Libyan civil war. So, I said Gaddafi maintained peace and stability there for decades. Not a nice person, but he maintained stability and peace there. Yemeni crisis, which is still going on today, civil war there, terrible stuff. Anyway, so the early hopes that these popular movements would end corruption, increase political participation, and bring about greater economic equity quickly collapsed. Then idealists, very naive, and when idealists get involved in anything, the result is a total disaster. Bolsheviks, communists, they're all idealists. You need to be a realist, understand this is the way the world works. It's not the way I would like the world to work, but this is just the way it works. You can see what's going on now in the Ukraine. That's, again, the same sort of problem. Yes, I'm muting myself. Okay, so now we've got the Abraham. Under Obama, there's no progress in the Middle East in terms of, under Obama, you had the Arab Spring. To what extent the American administration of Obama inspired it is sometimes up for debate. Anyway, during Obama's presidency, it was a total disaster in the Middle East. The only useful thing he did, I guess, was get Osama bin Laden assassinated, but didn't do much else. Anyway, so under Trump, President Trump, there was wanted to try and do something, got his son-in-law Kushner to get involved in trying to work something out for the Middle East. Then 2019, there was a Warsaw Conference. The United States and Poland sponsored it, and Israel was there, UK was there, sorry, that's supposed to be UK, not Poland, and Arab countries came. Germany, France, most other European countries, most other countries didn't want to participate. A, they didn't like President Trump, and B, they realized that the main point of the conference was to focus on Iran's influence and terrorism in the region. This is the main point of why Israel and the Arabs were getting together. So with the collapse of Iraq, which is the main bulwark against Iran, the Arab countries now felt very vulnerable. Yeah, Saudi Arabia felt vulnerable because Iran then was expanding its control authority over Iraq, which is adjacent to Saudi Arabia, is interfering in the Yemen, interfering in Syria, interfering in the Lebanon, interfering in all over the place. And so Arabs then felt we've got to try and do something, find some kind of coalition against Iran. And so this is the basis then for this conference, Iran's influence and terrorism in the region, stemming, as I said, from the Iranian Revolution. And then that's why most European countries didn't want to get involved in this conference, because they had signed this agreement with Iran to allow Iran to develop, I can't remember what it was called now, some economic agreement that had been sponsored by Obama. And other European countries supported that initiative by Obama, which basically allowed Iran to continue to develop its nuclear program. Israel wasn't happy with that. Arab countries weren't happy with that. Anyway, so when the conference was announced, even though that was the main point, was about Iran, this wasn't advertised or in the concluding statement. And so terrorism, extremism, missile development, proliferation, maritime trade and security, threats posed by proxy groups across the region was presented as the reason for the conference, not saying actually it's Iran who's behind all of this stuff. Anyway, so as a result of that, this conversation then, Arabs realized we need to get Israel on our side. The Iranians want to destroy Israel, so my enemy's enemy is my friend. So if Iran wants to destroy Israel, perhaps maybe Israel can come and support us. Perhaps we need to get Israel onto our side and work together with Israel to form a coalition against Iran. And so the following year, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized relations with Israel, the two Arab countries in the, whatever that part of the Middle East is called. And so these two countries, together with Israel, signed the Abraham Accords 20 September 2020. And then immediately after, within a few weeks, months after that, then Sudan, Morocco, and Jordan also joined the Abraham Accords. And there was some countries that were teetering upon, like Oman, teetering upon signing the Abraham Accords. But at that time, the American election was coming up and people thinking, well, is Trump going to be elected or not? Because this is very much Trump's initiative. So they were waiting to see who won the next American election. Obama, what's his name, won. Biden won the election. He was very much against Trump. He wasn't a fan of the Abraham Accords and wants to revive this treaty or whatever it is called with Iran. So some of the Arab countries, okay, America's no longer supporting the Abraham Accords, maybe we won't join in them. There's many disasters for reason why Biden got elected instead of Trump. Yeah, however unpleasant, to be honest, a person Trump is and was, his foreign policy was very clear and very good in many areas, like the Middle East. It's the first time there's been any serious progress for 40 years in the Middle East, to be honest. And also dealing with North Korea, also his dealings with, I'll come to all these other things later about Russia and Ukraine and Europe. Anyway, so we've got this relationship now. It's improved cultural and economic relations. They fly to each other. They've got embassies out now, I think most of these countries, more trade and business. And, it's good for these Arab countries to be able to have Israeli investment and economic investment, financial investment, and to have trade in both directions. And if you remember, that was the original deal between the Faisal and Weizmann in 1919. There was this realization by heart of moderate Arabs that it would be good to have Jews back in the Middle East, because wherever you have Jews living in a country, the economy always improves. When you have Jews living in a country, they invest. They've got all kinds of ideas. They start all kinds of businesses and educational projects and all kinds of things. They're hugely invested in education, hugely invested in law and justice, hugely invested in finances and banking, hugely invested in starting businesses. And so where you have lots of Jews living in a country, it leads to a huge amount of economic renaissance. That's what happened in Britain. When Jews started coming in the 17th century, it led to a big improvement in certain areas. Okay, so that's what's going on there. Okay, so that's basically, bringing up to date with what's going on in the Middle East today. And then, as I've said, sometimes Russia's involved with this. And so that's for that. Then, oh yeah, I'm stopping today. Okay, so I won't be here next week or the week after, so I can't remember what date I'm going to come back again. But when I do, then I'll start moving back to Europe and see how things developed after the Second War in Europe, the development of various European institutions, Council of Europe, the EU, what was behind that, the kind of policies behind that. That brings us up to the end of the Cold War, and what went on after the end of the Cold War, which the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is what we're supposed to be talking about, and the expansion of the EU, the expansion of NATO, and that brings us up to what's going on now, Russia and Ukraine. So the next segment of this workshop will be developments in Europe since the Second World War, during the Cold War period, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and bringing us up to what's going on now with Russia and Ukraine. Which, as I said, if you actually can see what went on in the past, it's not so hard to be able to anticipate what's going to come in the future. And, just like in the whole situation, Israel-Palestine, some terrible decisions were made, and the consequences flowed from those terrible decisions. And the same I can say, certain decisions that were made after the Second World War, certain way in which Europe developed, and certain decisions that were made after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which, certain scholars anticipate if you do this and you go there, the outcome is going to be a serious problem with Russia and especially the Ukraine.